The last thing I expected when I rolled up to my new ranch was to be screamed at by a woman in heels, wielding a garden rake like a medieval spear, yelling that I was trespassing on her land. Not the land she lived on, mind you, but the ranch I had just bought, fair and square, from her ex-husband. There I was, standing in dry dust with the keys to every barn and gate jingling in my pocket, when she came storming across the pasture like an HOA hurricane in designer sunglasses. I hadn't even unpacked my boots yet, and already I was being accused of property theft by someone who didn't even know the land wasn't hers anymore. What really threw me wasn't her anger or the threats about bylaws and sheriffs. It was that smug confidence in her eyes, like the whole world still owed her obedience. She pointed a manicured finger at me and snapped, "You've got 10 seconds to get off my ranch, or I'll have you arrested." And I almost laughed. Almost. Because what she didn't know, what would become the center of the storm in the weeks to follow, was that I didn't just buy this ranch. I bought it from the one person she never wanted to lose it to. And by the time she figured that out, the sheriff would already be on my porch, coffee in hand, shaking his head at what was about to go down. It had been 2 days since the moving truck dropped off my things. My ranch was 10 acres of peace, rolling pasture, and one of the sturdiest old barns I'd seen in years. Brad Albright had given me the full tour himself. He'd pointed out the creek where deer came down to drink at sunset and showed me the shed where he used to hide from his ex-wife, half joking, half scarred. He was a character. Rodeo belt buckle, sun-leathered hands, and a grin like he knew every secret this land had ever whispered. When we signed the deed over coffee and brisket, he just smiled and said, "Enjoy it, partner. She'll come around eventually. Just not the way she thinks." At first I thought he meant the weather. Maybe the coyotes. Turns out, he meant Karen. I had just finished hauling 2 feed bags to the barn when I saw the HOA sign nailed into my front fence. It hadn't been there before. Bright white, cheap plastic with the words "Community Regulated Property" in ugly red print. I stood there for a second, blinking like I was seeing things. This ranch sat outside the HOA boundaries. I had checked. Twice. Even the county maps showed the lines clear as day. But there it was, flapping in the breeze like a threat. That's when I heard the gravel spin behind me. A black Lexus SUV slid to a stop just past my gate. A tall woman in a jet-black top and beige pencil skirt stepped out, heels clicking like gunshots on gravel. She looked wildly out of place among the mesquite trees and cow patties. She had the poise of someone used to being obeyed, and the temper of someone who never heard the word no. "Excuse me," she barked, striding straight toward me with her arms crossed. "What exactly are you doing on this property?" I wiped the sweat from my brow, unsure if she was lost or just confused. "I live here. Bought the place last month from Brad Albright. Just getting settled." She froze mid-stride like I'd slapped her with a wet fish. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "You bought this ranch from Brad?" "Yep," I said slowly. "We signed everything at the county clerk's office. He even left me the gate keys and a smoked ham." She took a step back and actually scoffed. "That can't be. That's not possible. This land is part of the HOA jurisdiction. I'm the president. You're trespassing." I gave her a puzzled look. "No, ma'am. The HOA line ends 3 properties down." Brad showed me. He had a certified exclusion filed with the county 5 years ago after the divorce. That word hit her like a cattle prod. Her face darkened, lips pursed tight. She shook her head like she was trying to fling the reality away. "You're mistaken. He can't sell this without my permission." I shrugged. Apparently he could. And he did. She whipped out her phone like it was a badge. "You've got 2 options. Leave now or deal with the sheriff. I'm calling him." "You go ahead and do that," I said, pulling out my own phone. "You'll want to show him your ID." "I'll show him the deed." She didn't even pause. Dialed the number with fury in her fingers, pacing in a little circle like a panther about to pounce. I heard her tell the dispatcher that there was a man illegally occupying community property. She even had the nerve to say I looked suspicious. Like I was some kind of squat cowboy stealing hay and dignity. While she waited for the sheriff, I walked to my truck and grabbed the manila envelope holding every scrap of legal paper I had on this land. Ownership title. Exclusion letter. County map. The works. By the time the squad car pulled up 20 minutes later, Karen was practically foaming at the mouth. Sheriff Delaney stepped out, slow and calm, sunglasses on, coffee cup in hand. He was local, and I'd met him briefly at the town diner a week earlier. He gave me a polite nod, then turned to Karen with a sigh that said he'd done this before. "All right, Karen. What seems to be the emergency?" She launched into a speech about squatters, forged documents, and how I was dangerously ignorant of community policy. The sheriff listened patiently, nodded once, then turned to me. "Got your documents?" I handed them over. He looked through them slowly, flipping from one page to the next. He pulled out the exclusion certificate and let out a low whistle. "Well now," he muttered. "This here says the property was legally separated from the HOA 5 years ago. This sale checks out. You're on solid ground." Karen gasped like someone had shot her. "That can't be. That's not right. Brad wouldn't do that." Delaney raised an eyebrow. "Seems he did. This was filed with the county clerk in 2019. Clean and proper. Hate to break it to you, Karen, but this man has every right to be here." Her face twisted. "You're siding with a stranger over your own community president." "I'm siding with the law," Delaney said flatly. "And the law says this is his land." Karen stood silent for a beat. Then, with all the fury of a spoiled queen dethroned, she stomped back to her car and slammed the door so hard it echoed across the pasture. As she sped off in a cloud of self-righteous dust, Sheriff Delaney handed me back the folder. "You might want to put up a few cameras," he said. "She doesn't lose easy." I nodded. "She sure doesn't take surprises well." He chuckled. "Nope. But you haven't seen anything yet." I turned and looked out at the open pasture, the barn, the hills beyond. The sun was starting to dip, casting golden light over everything I now owned. It should have felt peaceful. But I knew from that look in her eyes, from the way she'd stared at the fence like it betrayed her, that this wasn't over. Not even close. The next morning brought a stillness to the ranch that was almost too perfect, the kind of quiet that usually means something's brewing just past the tree line. I was sitting on the porch drinking coffee when I spotted a little white envelope tucked under a rock on the gatepost. It wasn't a neighborly welcome note. It was an official-looking HOA violation slip, printed on cheap glossy paper with red ink screaming at me about an unauthorized structure on the property. I read it twice. The structure in question? My barn. The same barn that had stood there for the past 60 years, probably longer than the HOA had even existed. I chuckled and tossed it on the porch table. This woman really was trying everything. I figured she'd move on after being humiliated in front of the sheriff, but apparently, Karen wasn't the type to retreat. She was the type who doubled down. Around noon, I heard Macy and Clint laughing near the feed shed. When I got closer, I saw them holding a stack of similar notices, each more absurd than the last. One claimed my windmill was a potential hazard to air traffic. Another warned about the improper storage of hay, and one even cited me for unapproved livestock gatherings. Clint held that one up, grinning. "Guess your cows need a permit to hang out now." I shook my head, but I'll admit I had to laugh. It was so over the top it felt like satire. Still, it was a clear sign Karen wasn't done throwing punches. She had found a new battlefield, and she thought paperwork would bury me. That evening, I spotted something glinting in the sky over the back field. At first, I thought it was a hawk catching the sun. Then it hovered, turned, buzzed. A drone. I walked slowly toward the fence line, watching it zip above the barn and around the water trough. It dipped low, angled its tiny lens at my face, and then veered off toward the north end of the property. I followed it with binoculars, watching it rise and disappear behind a 2-story stucco house just beyond my boundary line. I knew whose house it was. The same SUV was parked out front, right beside a stack of new HOA president signs leaning against the wall. Karen was watching me, recording me, probably narrating to herself in that clipped voice of hers. The next morning, I printed out a sign in bold black ink. I strung it across the top of the barn with twine and duct tape. It read, "Private Ranch. Trespassers will be cow-slapped." Clint nearly choked on his coffee when he saw it. That's gonna get her blood boiling. That was the idea. I wanted to see how far she'd go. And sure enough, 2 hours later, I heard from Sheriff Delaney again. He drove up in his dusty cruiser, stepped out shaking his head and holding another stack of papers. "You've been busy," he said with a smirk. "Or she has." He handed me the stack. More complaints. Noise violations, property code breaches, even a claim that I'd been harassing her by making threatening agricultural statements. I blinked at that one. Delaney gave me a look like he couldn't believe he had to say it out loud. "She says your cow's mooed," in a tone she felt was deliberately aggressive. I laughed out loud. He didn't. "It gets better," he added. "She's now claiming your ranch is technically within HOA bounds because of a boundary dispute dating back to 1998. Says she has maps to prove it." I frowned. That part didn't sit right. The county lines were crystal clear when I checked. And Brad had even warned me, half joking, that Karen never really understood where her authority ended. But I wanted to be sure. So after Delaney left, I grabbed my truck keys and headed to the county records office. It was a little brick building with buzzing fluorescent lights and a front desk lady who'd probably been there since the Nixon administration. I asked for all property line documents on the Albright Ranch, past and present. The clerk took her time but eventually came back with a thick manila folder. Inside were not just maps and deeds, but something unexpected, a legal filing from Brad Albright, dated just months after his divorce. It was a formal request to have the entire ranch excluded from any current or future HOA expansions. And it had been approved, stamped, filed, recorded. Karen must have known about it, or maybe she never read the post-divorce papers. Either way, it meant that her little empire didn't reach even 1 inch onto my land. There was also a notarized note in Brad's handwriting. It read, "This property is no longer part of the Oakwood Lakes HOA. And if Karen has a problem with that, she can try suing the trees." I couldn't help but laugh. Brad knew what he was doing. He had been waiting for this fallout long before I ever showed up. And I was starting to suspect that part of the reason he sold the ranch to me, instead of a faceless developer, was because he wanted someone who wouldn't roll over. I returned home with the documents and scanned them all into my laptop. I printed copies and had them laminated. One set went on the fence by the gate. Another went on the barn door. A third I planned to hand-deliver to the HOA board just for fun. That evening, I walked the perimeter of the ranch with Macy, checking for more signs or planted evidence. Karen had already tried to sneak another violation notice under a pile of feed near the stable. This time it accused me of hosting unregistered livestock events. Macy raised an eyebrow. "Is that HOA code for feeding animals now?" I shrugged. "If I put a ribbon on the pig, maybe she'll think it's a parade." Over the next few days, things quieted down. No new visits. No fresh notices. The drone didn't fly by again. I started to think maybe the legal documents had done their job. But then, I got a call from Brad. He sounded amused. "You meet the firestorm yet?" I chuckled and told him she'd shown up on day 1. "She's not used to losing," he said. "And she never believed I'd actually sell it to someone outside her little kingdom." I asked him if he had any more tricks up his sleeve. He just said, "You're holding the winning hand. Just don't fold when she brings out the smoke machine." The next morning, an official-looking letter arrived from the HOA itself, not Karen. It was an invite to attend a board meeting as a newly reported community member. I stared at the line twice. The wording wasn't a request. It was an attempt to rope me into their world by pretending